Welcome back to Dark Domain, where the shadows grow darker and reality bends just enough to leave you unsettled. Tonight we're diving into the chilling depths of three unsettling tales: strange hospital encounters, eerie corridors, and unexplained happenings that will make you second-guess what's real. These stories aren't for the faint of heart, so get ready for a journey through the unknown. Before we begin, hit that like button and subscribe to Dark Domain. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself. Because not all mysteries are meant to be solved. The Haunting Within. It was 3 years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. That moment when I knew something was seriously wrong with me. I had been feeling off for days. Nothing too alarming at first. Headaches, confusion, that sort of thing. It wasn't until the hallucinations began that I realized I might be in real danger. It started with a headache so intense I couldn't get out of bed. My husband, Mark, had already left for work, and I was alone in the house, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, hoping it would pass. The throbbing pain in my skull was unbearable, but I was too exhausted to even get up and take something for it. That's when I heard it. A small, soft voice. It said one word, barely a whisper. "Mom?" I shot up in bed, my heart racing. The voice had come from downstairs, but the problem was, we didn't have any kids. I tried to reason with myself, blaming the fever and the nausea. I was probably imagining things. Still, the sound of that voice chilled me to the core. I sat there for a minute listening, waiting for the voice to speak again. But there was nothing, only silence. I felt ridiculous for being so shaken up, but there was something about the voice. It sounded so real. Gathering what little energy I had, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up, immediately regretting it as a wave of dizziness washed over me. I had to grip the bedpost just to stay upright. Slowly, I made my way to the top of the stairs. I didn't know what I expected to find down there. A child? Someone else in the house? I called out Mark's name, even though I knew he was at work. When I got no answer, I turned and went back to bed, telling myself I was being ridiculous. That should have been the end of it. But as I lay back down, a second voice called out, this time louder. "Hello?" It came from the same direction, downstairs, but this voice wasn't a child's. It was clearer, more distinct, almost like it was trying to get my attention. I felt a shiver creep down my spine. I was home alone. No one else should have been there. I was too weak to go downstairs again, and a part of me didn't want to. What was I going to find? Instead, I grabbed my phone off the nightstand and dialed Mark's number. He picked up after 2 rings, and I immediately blurted out what had happened, my voice shaky with fear. "There's someone in the house," I said. "I'm hearing voices, Mark. They're calling out to me." He tried to calm me down, telling me it was probably just a fever, that maybe I was hallucinating. I wanted to believe him, but the voices had felt so real. Mark promised he would come home early to take me to the hospital, but in the meantime, I needed to rest. As soon as I hung up, I felt a wave of nausea hit me. I barely made it to the bathroom before vomiting violently into the toilet. My head felt like it was going to explode, and the dizziness was worse than ever. I could barely see straight. That's when I heard it again. A voice, only this time, it was right outside the bathroom door. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but I knew someone was there. I froze, my mind racing. The voice was soft, almost muffled, like someone whispering. But it was close, too close. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it was closing up. I slowly turned my head toward the bathroom door, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was no one. The door was still shut, and I was alone. Or was I? By the time Mark arrived, I was curled up in bed, sweating profusely and shaking. The voices had stopped, but the fear hadn't. I could still feel that someone, or something, had been in the house with me. Mark rushed me to the hospital, where I was immediately admitted. It didn't take long for the doctors to diagnose me with bacterial meningitis. They told me that I was lucky to have gotten there in time because if I had waited any longer, the outcome could have been far worse. As it was, I'd have to stay for several days, possibly even a week, depending on how my body responded to treatment. As they hooked me up to an IV for antibiotics, I asked the doctor about the hallucinations. He assured me that it wasn't uncommon for patients with severe infections like mine to experience vivid, sometimes terrifying hallucinations, especially when the brain is under such intense strain. That explanation made sense at the time, but it didn't stop me from feeling like there was more to it than just an infection. That night, after Mark left to go home, I drifted off to sleep almost immediately, but my dreams were far from peaceful. I found myself back in the house, only it wasn't empty this time. My ex-husband David was there, sitting by my bed, watching me. His expression was cold, calculating. He reached out, patting my head in a way that made my skin crawl. "I'm glad you're okay," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I came as soon as I saw Mark leave." He leaned in closer, his breath hot against my face. "You know I could kill him, right? I despise him, always have." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. All I could do was lay there, frozen, as he continued to talk about how much he hated my husband, how he wanted to hurt him. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he stood up, patted my head again, and left the room. When I woke up, I was drenched in sweat. My heart was pounding, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. But what shook me the most was the chair. It was pulled up right next to my hospital bed, as though someone had been sitting there just like in my dream. I didn't remember anyone sitting in that chair before I fell asleep, and no one had visited me after Mark left. The next morning, I told the nurse about my strange dream, trying to laugh it off as just a side effect of the illness. But her response sent a chill down my spine. "That wasn't a dream," she said, her expression serious. "Your cousin came to visit you late last night." My stomach dropped. I didn't have any cousins, at least none that lived nearby. When I pressed her for more details, she said his name was David. I felt my blood run cold. David was my ex-husband. For the rest of my hospital stay, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I texted David, demanding to know why he had come to visit me and how he knew I was in the hospital. He denied everything, saying he had no idea what I was talking about. His text was calm, almost mocking. I never got a straight answer from him, and I never told Mark about the hallucinations or the threats. Even now, I wonder if it was all just a fever dream, or if there was something darker at play. All I know is I'll never forget the voices, the whispers, or the chair sitting too close to my bed in the middle of the night. The nurse's shift. It was supposed to be just another night on the job. Emily had been working the night shift for almost 3 years at St. Vincent's Hospital, a facility in the middle of downtown. She had seen it all: emergency traumas, bizarre cases, and even the occasional overdose. But nothing ever unsettled her quite like the eerie, creeping quiet of the hospital at 3 a.m. That night was particularly quiet. Too quiet. Emily sat behind the nurse's station, scrolling through patient charts on her tablet. Her colleague, Joan, had just gone to take a quick nap in the break room. Emily didn't mind. She was used to being alone on these late shifts. Besides, they were well-staffed tonight, and most of the patients were either stable or sleeping. But something about the stillness felt off. The hospital felt colder than usual, and a strange hum seemed to reverberate through the walls. She thought about mentioning it to maintenance, but decided against it. It was probably just the old building settling. Hospitals were full of strange noises. As she reviewed the chart of a patient down in room 314, a long-term patient recovering from surgery, she noticed something strange. The name on the chart was unfamiliar. Emily was sure she had checked in on every patient earlier, but this name, David Carson, hadn't been there. Puzzled, she grabbed the master chart, flipping through the list of current patients. Room 314 was marked as empty. There wasn't supposed to be anyone in that room tonight. A knot of unease formed in her stomach. Maybe it was a clerical error. The hospital system wasn't the most reliable, but a sense of dread crawled up her spine. She felt the weight of the quiet pressing down on her, and that cold, buzzing sensation grew stronger. Against her better judgment, Emily decided to check the room. The hallways were dark and deserted. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead only added to the tension. As she neared room 314, her steps slowed. She half hoped she'd find the room empty, just like the chart said. She reached the door, hesitating before grasping the handle. A faint creaking noise echoed down the hall. She froze, her hand hovering above the door. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, growing closer. Emily's pulse quickened, and she turned to peer down the hallway. But it was empty. Shaking off the unease, she pushed open the door to room 314. Inside, the air was stifling, thick with the smell of disinfectant. The bed was made, untouched. No sign of anyone having been there. But on the floor near the window, she noticed something that stopped her cold. A pair of muddy footprints. They led from the window to the foot of the bed, as though someone had climbed in from outside, but they stopped abruptly like the person who made them had just vanished. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. This didn't make any sense. She quickly backed out of the room, pulling the door shut behind her. Her mind raced with possibilities. Maybe some homeless person had found their way inside, though how they managed to get up to the third floor was beyond her. She needed to tell Joan. As she made her way back to the nurse's station, Emily's hands began to shake. The dim lights overhead flickered again, casting long, shifting shadows along the walls. She was almost to the station when she heard it. The sound of labored breathing. It was coming from behind her. Emily turned, her breath catching in her throat. At the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light, stood a figure. They were hunched over, their breathing ragged and deep, like they were struggling for air. "Sir?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Are you all right?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, its breath rattling louder and louder. Emily's instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The figure took a slow, shuffling step forward, and as it did, a faint light from a nearby window illuminated its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where its face should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin. No eyes, no mouth. Just nothing. Emily's scream caught in her throat as the figure took another step, its hands reaching out toward her, gnarled and twisted. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet in her panic. Desperate to escape, she turned and bolted toward the nurse's station. By the time she reached it, she could barely breathe, her chest tight with fear. She slammed the door to the station shut, locking it behind her. The figure, whatever it was, had disappeared. But Emily could still hear that horrible breathing, faint and echoing down the hall. "Joan!" she gasped, pounding on the door to the break room. "Joan, wake up!" There was no response. The break room was dark. She fumbled for her phone, hands shaking as she dialed security, but the line was dead. No dial tone, no sound at all. It was as if the entire hospital had fallen into some kind of eerie, suspended state. Emily's eyes darted around the station, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. Her heart hammered in her chest. She wasn't imagining this. She couldn't be. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. In the reflection of a monitor screen, the figure stood behind her. Emily whipped around, but the room was empty. The air around her felt thick, oppressive, and that awful breathing sound returned, louder and closer. She backed into a corner, clutching a pair of scissors she had grabbed from the counter, her only defense against whatever was hunting her. Suddenly, the lights flickered once more and the breathing stopped. For several minutes, Emily stood frozen in place, her grip on the scissors tight, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the hospital had returned to its unsettling stillness. By the time Joan emerged from the break room, bleary-eyed and confused, the strange events had ceased. Emily could barely find the words to explain what she had seen. But when they checked room 314 together, the muddy footprints were gone, the floor pristine. There was no evidence of anything unusual at all. but Emily knew what she had seen. And even now, on her future shifts, she could still hear that faint, distant breathing. She knew it was only a matter of time before whatever it was returned. The haunting echoes of the hospital ward. I've worked in several hospitals over the years, but the geriatric facility I took a position at a few years back was by far the most unnerving. It wasn't something I noticed immediately, just small details at first, but my second-to-last shift there would be a night I'd never forget. It was the graveyard shift as usual. I was exhausted, running on hardly any sleep, but that wasn't new for me. The hospital was only about 30 minutes from my house, and I'd worked with elderly patients for years, so I was no stranger to the challenges. What was different this time, though, was the ward I'd been assigned to, the Alzheimer's unit. The patients in the Alzheimer's ward were quiet for the most part, often lost in their own worlds. They didn't communicate much, but they seemed to appreciate my presence. Maybe it was because I was younger, in my 20s, a fresh face in a place where time seemed to stand still for them. There was one patient, though, who stood out from the rest. Lena. Lena was more restless than the others. She would often call me into her room, claiming she heard voices. I didn't think much of it at first. Patients with dementia often experienced hallucinations. But what she described was unsettling. She kept talking about a man in black, standing in the corner of her room just watching her. Each time she mentioned him, her face would pale, her voice trembling. It wasn't just her fear that unnerved me. There was something about the way she described the man. His stillness, his silence, and the unnerving smile she claimed he wore. Every time I entered her room, I felt a chill in the air. But when I checked, there was no one there. On that particular night, Lena was more agitated than ever. She gripped my hand, her eyes wide and fearful, whispering that the man had moved closer, that he was watching her sleep. I tried to calm her down, telling her that no one was there, that it was all just in her mind. But as I spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was in the room with us. By 11 p.m., most of the patients had fallen asleep. The hospital became deathly quiet, the kind of silence that makes every creak and groan of the building sound amplified. Lena had finally drifted off, so I took the opportunity to stock up on supplies in the linen room, trying to keep myself busy. That's when I heard it. A noise, soft, almost imperceptible, coming from behind me. The linen room was small, the door closed tightly behind me. I froze, listening. Nothing. I shook it off, assuming it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But then I felt something unmistakable. A hand, a cold, heavy hand on my shoulder. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was no one there. The room was empty. I stared at the door, half expecting someone to be standing on the other side, but it remained shut. I stepped into the hallway, glancing around, hoping to catch sight of a fellow nurse or maybe even a patient who had wandered out of their room. But the hallway was deserted. I went back into the linen room, my hands shaking as I tried to finish stocking the cart. The unease was growing in my chest, and I wanted nothing more than to be done with my shift. I turned to leave, but as I faced the door, I saw him. A man, dressed in black, staring at me through the small window in the door, smiling. I stumbled backward, falling to the floor as a scream tore from my throat. The man didn't move, didn't react. He just stood there, grinning at me through the glass. I must have screamed louder than I realized, because the next thing I knew, a fellow nurse rushed into the room, pulling me up from the floor. I was shaking, barely able to form coherent words. I pointed to the door, trying to explain what I had seen, but the man was gone. Vanished. My colleague looked at me, confused. "What man?" she asked, glancing around. "There's no one here." I knew what I had seen. I wasn't imagining it. But she didn't believe me. She said the ward was quiet and no one had been wandering around. I insisted that there was a man in black, watching us through the window. But no matter how much I protested, there was no sign of him. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Lena woke up screaming about the voices again, this time more frantic than before. She begged me to take her away, said the man was coming for her. I asked her what he looked like, if he was smiling. Her expression darkened, and she grabbed my arm with surprising strength for someone so frail. "How did you know?" she whispered, her voice trembling with terror. How did you know he was smiling? That was the last straw for me. I requested to be transferred to a different ward for the remainder of the night, unable to shake the eerie feeling that lingered in my mind. The next day, I sent a message to the head nurse telling her that I couldn't do it anymore, that my next shift would be my last. I've never been diagnosed with anything. I've never hallucinated before. I understand the effects of sleep deprivation, but this wasn't a hallucination. I know what I saw. The man in black, smiling through the glass, was real. You've made it to the end of another unsettling journey through the shadows. But remember, the dark never really leaves. It's always waiting, just out of sight. If these stories sent a chill down your spine, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Dark Domain. There are plenty more tales waiting to be told. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, the darkest mysteries are always closer than you think.